So from this point, now that we have our very basic foundations that are established, there's still gonna be a bit of back and forth because I still want to improve this a little bit before moving on to the final matte painting. So this is like the first step of the matte painting batch, just establish the very basic render and projection elements. But now that I see the foreground, I kind of want to do something a bit better that is a lot closer to what we will have in our final matte painting. This is actually quite important. So to do so, I'm going to use a software called World Machine, and it's extremely easy to use. It's a node-based software, so this is an example of a terrain. It's really easy. You start usually with a layout, in this case, basic layout generator. Then you have a bunch of other nodes that I'm going to show. So you can also use, for example, and I will do that, the example worlds as a starting point. It's always easy. You have the curve that work basically exactly the curves in Photoshop. You have erosion that is very useful. But if I go here in my layout generator, this is where you will, I would say, draw the basic shape of your terrain. And you have a few tools for that. You can do like a circle, you can do polygons, lines, stuff like that. Then you can modify the shape. You can play with your fall of distance, the opacity, and a bunch of other stuff. I personally don't consider myself as an expert of World Machine, not by any means, but the good thing is that you don't need to be one. All I want really for this foreground and even for the midground is something really basic. We really don't need much, to be honest. What I'm simply going to do is try to draw here some really basic shapes of what this terrain could look like, still keeping in mind that it's got to be some kind of a canyon because the camera has to fly through it. Then we can go into our advanced purling and see what we have here. So you can play with the scale a little bit. That's going to affect the scale of the details, how noisy basically your details are going to be. You have a bunch of other options. I'm not going to cover them all. I would say at this stage, you try to experiment a little bit with those. Those are pretty much self-explanatory. You can see immediately the results in this top left window here. You can get a preview, and I will show you later on how to build terrain so you can see how it looks. Then you have the curve. As you can see, you can play a little bit with those to like increase or decrease the strength of those settings that we had into the advanced purling. And you can go into the erosion, which is really probably the most important node of my graph here. You can play a little bit with those settings. Once again, just try to experiment at this stage. I don't have any specific guidelines for you guys. There are a bunch of free tutorials you can find online, I think, or just open one of the example worlds, and we'll do that later, actually. So just go now to the project settings for a little bit. Right now, I'm going to put the resolution quite low, so it builds quite quickly. Just so you know, guys, World Machine is a CPU-based software, so that means the more threads you have in your CPU, the faster it's going to be. If you don't have an amazing CPU, just pay attention to that into the settings, put something quite low. The good thing is that since this terrain is going to be completely covered by trees, we actually don't need like a super detailed geometry, to be honest. So I can get away with doing something quite simple. Here I'm going to use actually a polygon to do something a little bit different. Still keeping in mind that I want to try to get this sort of canyon at some point. Something like this should be fine, I think. There might be a little bit of back and forth at this stage, but that's perfectly fine. Just take your time. Okay, so now I'm gonna export my terrain. So I'm just gonna go ahead and click on my mesh output node. If you don't have it, you can import it by, you can find it under the output menu. So here we have a bunch of options. I'm not gonna touch anything. The only thing I'm gonna do is just to specify where I want to save this. So as you can see, it's gonna be in work, learn squared, World Machine, hill, or in OBJ. Actually, this is where I'm gonna save it. In OBJ, you can just name it however you want. And then once you're all ready, you can just go ahead and click on write output to disk. There you go. Then what you can do is import your newly exported terrain inside of your Maya scene. So import OBJ. Probably gonna need to scale it and also to rotate it for some reason. There you go. Then trying to place it. So at this point, it's very likely that you will have to go back to World Machine, then go back to Maya again, and so on for a bunch of times. but that's fine. It's expected. So like I can see here, it's not working perfectly. But then what I will also do is maybe try to adjust my shot a little bit, the composition according to the terrain that I have. So the goal is not exactly to make the terrain work perfectly for the shot, but maybe try to sort of find a middle ground, I guess. But it's already quite nice, I mean, and much better than a really raw and basic terrain that I had before. So this is just an extra step I like to do for the matte painting bash, because the terrain is quite an important element of the landscape, obviously. So you do want to have a base that is a bit more advanced than just a plane with a few faces moved. So it's already quite nice, to be honest. But I will need to go back to a World Machine for sure, but that's okay. Like, yeah, I have this hill here. Don't want to fly through this hill, obviously, so I might also have to move a little bit the city later on. We'll see. Yeah, it can be a bit tedious for sure, but to be honest, that's sort of part of it. I mean, doing those kind of things in CG matte painting, it does get tedious at some points, so that's expected. Cool. Alright, so just doing some tiny adjustments here. So just typing some values, increasing them, decreasing them a little bit. Just doing some very slight adjustments. And one thing that I also notice, now that I have this much more detailed terrain, I have a much better sense of the scale. And that allows me to notice that the camera move at this stage is probably a bit too fast. So what I'm probably going to do later on is to increase the frame range, because I kind of like the camera move that I have. And now that I think of it, it doesn't hurt actually to have a shot a bit longer. It could actually be cool. Alright, I think we're pretty good. I'm just gonna go back to World Machine at some point, I think, to refine this slightly. So it's a lot of back and forth, checking if everything works fine, and replaying the sequence over and over again. So I know this might seem a bit boring, but once again, I say it again, you just want to make sure that everything is very well prepared for the detailing phase and shading and matte painting. Right now, it's really the boring part, unfortunately. Okay, so I think we're pretty good for now. So what I'm going to do now is to work on our mid-ground hill. Let's call it like that. So we can go back into World Machine. And I'm just going to use the same graph as I used for our foreground terrain. Just going to go back to the layout generator. Make sure first you save your graph for this new mountain maybe. So let's just delete this and we're going to draw probably a new layout. This one is going to be a bit more simple because our main mid-ground hill is just a very classic mountain, I guess. Might just need one circle here with the second one for like this sort of side hill that we have, so it's not like perfectly like a cone, I guess. Playing a little bit here with those settings, the fall of distance, the opacity. And now I'm gonna draw a second one on the side. It's gonna be a bit smaller. So as you can see, it's really nothing too complicated. And it doesn't have to be, I mean, you know, sometimes I think you would be surprised to see how, I would dare to say basic the techniques are that are used even in the biggest movies. I mean, you would think that it's extremely technical, extremely difficult, but what I personally found out while working in this industry is that in the end, the only thing that matters is if the shot looks good or not. It doesn't really matter how you get there. So there are different ways of doing what I'm doing here. Other people would use a different software. Maybe somebody would start to do this mountain inside of ZBrush. Or a person would do a much more advanced kind of texturing than what I'm going to do. Or maybe somebody else would do a fully 2D matte painting. So it really depends. And I think you would be surprised to know how that in the end doesn't really matter. That's at least what I found out. Anyway, so here I'm just building here this first version of our mid-ground hill to see how this looks. Doing here in a quite decent resolution, I guess. I do want to have a lot of details, especially if I end up adding a little bit of direct sunlight. Because the more details you have on your mountain, the more it's going to pick up the nice direct light coming from the sun. Even it's very subtle. Changing the settings a little bit of the erosion. So this terrain is slightly less basic than the foreground, which can be low res, but this one I definitely want to add a lot more details. So once again, yeah, if you do have a CPU that is not amazing, just do a lower resolution than what I'm doing. You will see that there will always be a way to work around that using the 2D DMP techniques and projection stuff that I will demonstrate on later. So yeah, I'm spending just a little bit more time here because this is our hero assets, I would say. It's kind of the focus of the shot, this mountain. So you do want to make it kind of decent before moving on to the texturing. I'm also thinking about how the castle is gonna sit, how the trees are gonna sit, because I'm probably make some trees grow on this mountain as well. Okay, so now that I'm pretty happy, I just increased the resolution a little bit. I build the terrain once again. Gonna quickly just speed this up here. Done, cool. So let's just quickly turn around to see how this looks. Nice, I have a good amount of detailing that is gonna work really nice with the kind of texturing that I'm gonna do. So I can go ahead and export this. So just specify the right name like I have here, hill, midground actually, not foreground this time. Then you can just click write output to disk. Once again, depending on the resolution of your terrain and the kind of machine that you have, this might take a bit longer or less longer, it depends. Cool. Now, what I'm gonna do is export another resolution of this terrain, like a really low res version. And the reason I'm doing that is that I'm gonna scatter trees on this geometry, but I don't want to scatter trees on top of a super detailed terrain. That is gonna make Maya crash for sure. And it doesn't need to be extremely detailed. So I'm gonna use a low res version of this terrain for the mesh instancers, basically. Even low res like I'm doing here, so like 256. And it's gonna be enough. Because we will not obviously render this terrain. It's just gonna sit hidden in our scene so we can use it to scatter trees or maybe even rocks or other assets, but we'll talk about that later. So I'm just naming everything properly here. Cool. So let's go back to Maya now and import this terrain. There you go. And once that is done, you can immediately import the low-res version. And you can put those inside of a group. So you can click Ctrl G. And the goal of that is now we can scale them and move them, and they are still perfectly aligned between them. So you make sure you select the group and not the individual terrains. So same process as the foreground, just a matter of placing this. We might still do some tweaks going back to World Machine, but I don't know yet. Let's try. And it's already working quite well. I may just need to rotate this, see. I can sort of make it look how it should. Cool. And once you're quite happy, you can get rid also of the lowest version here. You don't need that anymore. You can delete it or just hide it, but I don't think we need it at all at this point, so you can just go ahead and delete it. And you also want to hide the lowest version and maybe deactivate the wireframe here because that's a mess. Cool. And you can see all those nice details. It might get the viewport quite heavy once again if you don't have like an amazing machine, so just pay attention to that. And as you can see right away, I think we have now a much better impression of how the shot is going to look. The scale is sold a lot more, and I have an idea now if this shot, if the camera, for example, is moving too fast or not. I still don't know for sure at this point. I quite like what I'm seeing. So once again, let's just rename everything properly. I know it's kind of tedious, kind of boring, but the scene is gonna get really complex at some point. So you really want to make sure once again that those foundations and the naming conventions are kind of okay. It doesn't need to be like extremely precise when you do like a shot by yourself, but still try to stay organized as much as possible. Usually what I tend to do is first import my elements, work a little bit, and maybe every 5 or 10 minutes make sure that everything is still named properly. Okay, so I'm quickly going back to World Machine because I want to export another version of my mid-ground terrain, something slightly less high-res, just in case I will need it, because if I can afford to not use the super high-res version that I have, well, it's better. Right now the scene is quite still light, but you will see that as we keep moving, the scene is gonna be more and more heavy, so the more optimized it can be, the more light it can be, where it can be, the better. So try to keep that in mind as you move along. Alright, so now that I have my terrain that is a lot more established, that is a lot more detailed, I can start to refine a little bit the composition, move around the kit bash elements, and just tweak this as much as I can. But at this moment I would say that we are in a pretty good place, so I'm going to spend just some time repeating the same process over and again, moving stuff around, adjusting here and there.